we're going to continue on in John chapter 11. And the last thing we looked at in the last program was verse 6, where it says he abode there 2 days. The 2 days is a prophetic picture of 2,000 years of time. That in Hosea chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, after 2 days he will revive us. So following the first coming of the Messiah, 2,000 years after, he will revive us. How are we being revived? We're being revived by being shown that our fathers have inherited lies, Jeremiah 16, verse 19. The primary lie, meaning that a believer in Yeshua as the Messiah should not express their faith in following the Torah. That's the primary lie that we have inherited. We would recognize this, our eyes would be opened, and we would return to the Torah in expressing our faith in Yeshua as Messiah, recognizing that He is the lawgiver and the bridegroom after 2,000 years. That's happening now. And then we cross over into the third day. And the third day He raises us up. That is, the third day begins in the beginning of the tribulation period where He gathers the 12 tribes of Israel, and we will live in His sight. He will set up His earthly kingdom, and Israel redeemed will rule and reign with the Messiah. John chapter 11, verses 7 and 8. Then after that He said to His disciples, "Let us go unto Judea again." And so this is a prophecy of the focus being put on the house of Judah, or the Jewish people, as we get to the end of 2,000 years and the beginning of the third day. And John 11, verse 8, His disciples say unto Him, "Master, the Jews of late sought to stone you." And this is a prophecy that if you would go to an Orthodox Jewish community today and stand out on the street and proclaim Yeshua is the Messiah, you will not be treated very well. They will want to rebuke you, and they'll want you to leave their neighborhood, to say it nicely. So there's the prophecy, the Jews of late sought to stone you. It's prophetic that traditional Jews, that would be Orthodox Jews, don't want to hear that Yeshua is the Messiah. So the question is, what? You want to go to them? You want to go to the Orthodox Jews who don't want to hear that you are the Messiah? And so this is connected with the prophecy in Micah chapter 5 in verses 2 and 3 that during the tribulation period, with the birth of the biblical state of Zion, Messiah will reveal Himself to His people and gather the 12 tribes of Israel. Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall He come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth has been from old, from everlasting. So this is referring to Yeshua the Messiah. He was born in Bethlehem. He's the King of Israel. He's the ruler of Israel. Therefore, He will give them up. That is, He will not reveal Himself fully to His people. That would be the house of Judah, or the Jewish people. That is corporately. Even unto Orthodox Jews, He will give them up, that is, hiding His face, until the time that she which travails, the one who travails, Isaiah 66 verse 8, is Zion. Till the one that travails brings forth, till the birth of Zion. The birth of Zion is physical. There will be a biblical state of Zion that will be birthed during the tribulation. But Zion is also spiritual. It is the coming together of the 12 tribes of Israel. Once Zion is brought forth, then the remnant of His brethren shall return unto the children of Israel. So the return is the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel, but returning is also a reference to believing that Yeshua is the Messiah as well. And so this is going to happen after 2 days into the beginning of the third day, that the Messiah is going to reveal His face, is the biblical term, to his people, no longer hiding his face. John chapter 11 and verse 9. Yeshua answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbles not, because he sees the light of this world." So walking is going to be a reference to following the Torah on the spiritual level. The Hebrew term used by the Jewish people for following the Torah is halakha. Halakha comes from the Hebrew word halak, which means to walk. If any man walks in the day, if you're walking in the day, you're following the Torah. If you're walking in the day, then you're walking in light. If you're walking in light, you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. So walking in the day is believing that Yeshua is the Messiah and following his Torah. So he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of this world. Who is the light of this world? It is Yeshua. In John chapter 8 and verse 12, Yeshua spake unto them, saying, "I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." So if you believe that he's the Messiah, you will be walking in light. You will make him Lord and Savior. You'll not be pursuing the world and the things of this world, which is associated with darkness. But if you follow him, you will not walk in darkness. And walking in darkness also refers to not walking according to the ways of the world, but you'll be walking and following his Torah. John chapter 9 and verse 5, Yeshua said, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." John chapter 12 verse 46, "I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believes on me should not abide in darkness." That if you believe on him, you shouldn't abide in darkness. Twofold meaning. If you believe on him, you should not be walking after the world and the world's ways and the world's systems and operating according to the world's values. But if you believe on him, you will not be abiding in darkness. Abiding in darkness means you don't follow the Torah, because the Torah is called light. Because the Torah was given by the lawgiver, who is the light of this world. So if you follow the light of the world, you'll follow the light that he gave. The light that he gave is his Torah. And if you follow his Torah, you're not abiding in darkness. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 23, we can see that the Torah is defined as being light. For the commandment is a lamp, and the Torah is light. And reproofs of instruction are the way of life. So, if you believe in the light of the world, you're not going to abide in darkness. Proverbs 6:23 says the Torah is light. If you're not abiding in darkness, then you're following the Torah. But what Torah are you following? The Torah of the lawgiver, the Torah of Yeshua. Isaiah in chapter 8 in verse 20. "To the Torah and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word," if they speak not according to the Torah, "it is because there's no light in them." So how is it if you don't speak according to the Torah, you have no light? Because Proverbs 6:23, the Torah is light. Yeshua is light. He is the lawgiver. John chapter 11 and verse 10. Yeshua said, "But if a man walk in the night, he stumbles, because there is no light in him." So when you walk in the night, you walk after the ways of the world and the world system and the world's values. If you walk in the night, you're not following the Torah. So in breaking the covenant at Mount Sinai, the prophets specify that the nation of Israel, or the house of Jacob, or the bride of Messiah, is walking in darkness. Isaiah chapter 59 verses 1 and 2. "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, neither his ear heavy that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you. See? Because you break the covenant, he hides his face from you. And we're told in Micah in chapter 5, verse 3, he will give them up, meaning he will hide his face, until she which travails has given birth, the birth of the state of Zion. So the regathering of his people is the revealing of his face to his people. Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 9. Because you're walking after sin, because his face is hid from you, therefore is judgment far from us, neither does justice overtake us. We wait for light, but behold obscurity, for brightness, but we walk in darkness. So we're waiting for light. We're waiting for the coming of the Messiah. We're waiting for the end of the exile. But in the meantime, we're not following the Torah of the Messiah. We're walking in darkness. Walking in darkness has a meaning of not only not following the Torah, but not believing that Yeshua is the Messiah. John chapter 8, verse 12. Then spake Yeshua again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that follows me will not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. John chapter 12, verse 46. Walking in darkness is not believing that Yeshua is the Messiah. I am come a light into the world, that whoever believes on me would not abide in darkness. Notice the word abide, it means to dwell, which means, as it relates to those who do believe in Yeshua as the Messiah, because he is the light of the world, it is not intended that you abide in darkness, meaning abiding in not following the Torah. That if you believe that Yeshua is Messiah, there's one lawgiver that's able to save, and if you don't abide in your darkness, you'll ultimately end up expressing your faith in him by following his Torah. He's the light of the world, and the Torah is light. His word is light. The valley of the shadow of death is exile in the nations. So the one that's going to gather the exiles of Israel is the Good Shepherd. Jeremiah 31:10. He who scattered Israel will gather him. And so the one that's going to gather is the Good Shepherd. Psalm 23 verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd. Yeshua is the Good Shepherd. I shall not want. Psalm 23 verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that is being exiled in the nations of the world, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Yeshua is with us. And your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He's even with his people in exile. And ultimately, he will gather them from exile. So we're taking key phrases and key words here in John chapter 11. We're biblically defining them, comparing Scripture with Scripture. 1 Corinthians in chapter 2. So now we're going to look at John chapter 11, verse 11, which says, These things said he, and after that he said unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may awake him out of his sleep. And so this sleep spiritually represents spiritual slumber of the exiles of Israel, in breaking the covenant, not realizing who the lawgiver is, who the bridegroom is, and not following his Torah. They are spiritually asleep. So, literally, Yeshua went to Lazarus, went to his grave, and spoke the words that he sleeps. In other words, he's not going to be dead and be waiting the resurrection, that Yeshua is going to go and resurrect him. But the deeper meaning is Lazarus represents the exiles of Israel who are in spiritual slumber. So let's see how it's prophesied that in the gathering of the exiles of Israel, that they will be awakened out of their spiritual slumber. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 17. Awake, awake. See, awake means to be awakened out of spiritual slumber. Stand up, O Jerusalem, which has drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. You have drunken the dregs of the cup of trembling and wrung them out. So Jerusalem is told, awake, awake. And now Isaiah chapter 52 in verse 1. Awake, awake. Put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For henceforth there shall no more come unto you the uncircumcised and the unclean. Well, if the uncircumcised and the unclean will no more come into Jerusalem or Zion, that means these are describing a people that's following the Torah, because you are unclean by not following the Torah. And by not following the Torah, you are uncircumcised as well. Now, the Torah specifies regarding circumcision that we are to be circumcised in heart, but the Torah also mentions about being circumcised in flesh as well. And so, ultimately, this is referring to returning to the Torah. But in returning to the Torah, it is said of Jerusalem, awake, awake. It means come out of your spiritual slumber. Now, let's see why Yeshua says is the reason why Lazarus is dead. In John chapter 11 and verse 14, it says, Then said Yeshua unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead. So he's describing what's happened and what the situation is literally, but spiritually he's communicating that the nation of Israel is exiled into the nations of the world, and they are likened unto being spiritually dead. And Ezekiel chapter 37, when it talks about the valley of the vision of the dry bones, and he says in Ezekiel 37 and verse 11, he said, these bones are the whole house of Israel. So the whole house of Israel, all 12 tribes, are likened to being dead. And so Ezekiel 37 goes on to say that he's going to gather them from the nations where they've been scattered, bring them into the land of Israel. And in doing so, it says in Ezekiel 37 and verse 12, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves. That is resurrection. So this is why Yeshua is going to resurrect Lazarus. Lazarus represents the 12 tribes of Israel. Now we're going to look at John chapter 11 and verse 15, where we are told here, I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent that you may believe. Now, understand the context. Believing what? We are showing you, thought by thought, that here the subject is that Yeshua is the Messiah and that he gathers the exiles of Israel. That's what you're to believe, who he is and what he does. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. Now, this picture that in order for the exiles of Israel to return, believe that Yeshua is Messiah and follow his Torah, that they have to be awakened out of spiritual slumber to recognize their condition and the situation. This is foreshadowed in Zechariah in chapter 4. So we're going to begin in verse 1, where it says, And the angel that talked with me came again, and he waked me as a man that is wakened out of his sleep. So here, Zechariah represents the nation of Israel, who is in spiritual slumber. Now verse 2, he said unto me, What do you see? And I said, I have looked, and behold, a candlestick, all of gold, with a bowl upon the top of it, and his 7 lamps thereon, and 7 pipes to the 7 lamps which were upon the top thereof. And so, when he's awakened out of his spiritual slumber, he says, what do you see? So, in order to see what he's being shown, you have to be awakened out of your spiritual slumber to see it. And the first thing he's shown is a candlestick, or this would be a menorah. And the menorah represents the nation of Israel, or the body of the Messiah. And in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 12, it says, "And I turned to see the voice that spake with me, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks." And then it goes on to explain to us in Revelation chapter 1, verse 20. Now the candlesticks is what's being seen here in Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 2. And then it says in Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, that the 7 candlesticks are the 7 churches, or the congregation, or the body of the Messiah. Now we're going to go to Zechariah chapter 4, verse 3. And not only is he awakened to see a candlestick, but and 2 olive trees by it, one upon the right side of the bowl and the other upon the left side thereof. So there is a menorah and 2 olive trees is what is being shown. You see, when we are awakened out of our spiritual slumber, that is the present body of Messiah, that what the God of Israel is trying to show us is our Hebraic roots. That in Messiah we are a part of the nation of Israel. As Paul explained in Ephesians chapter 2, a part of the commonwealth of Israel. And so we're to see that menorah, that candlestick, and then beside it is 2 olive trees. And the 2 olive trees represents the 2 houses of Israel, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Because in Jeremiah chapter 11, verses 16 and 17, the house of Israel and the house of Judah are likened unto an olive tree. And this is why Paul uses the olive tree analogy in Romans in chapter 11, because the olive tree represents the nation of Israel, who we are joined to, grafted into, for those who are of the nations, when they believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. Now, let's continue here in Zechariah chapter 4 and look at verses 5 and 6. Then the angel that talked with me answered and said, "Do you not know what these be? Do you not understand the candlestick and the 2 olive trees and what they mean and what they represent?" And he said, "No, my Lord." You see, in order to understand the candlestick and the 2 olive trees, you have to be awakened out of your spiritual slumber. So they represent the 2 houses of Israel, and what he's going to do with the 2 olive trees, he's going to make 1 olive tree out of it. Romans in chapter 11. But this work is not going to be a work of man. It is going to be a work of the Spirit of God to open up the eyes and the ears and the hearts and the minds of His people who are in spiritual slumber. So who is it that is in spiritual slumber? Well, Christianity is in spiritual slumber because they don't realize that they are to express their faith in Yeshua as the Messiah by following His Torah and that He's the lawgiver. Judaism is in spiritual slumber because they don't recognize that the lawgiver is Yeshua the Messiah, and they are to follow His Torah rather than the Torah of the rabbis. And so this work will be a work that will be accomplished by the Spirit of God. That's why it says in Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6, "Then he answered and spake unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts." what is by His Spirit? It is being awakened out of your sleep. It is seeing the candlestick and the 2 olive trees and understanding what it means. That is what is by His Spirit. So this is the prophetic meaning which is being communicated to us in John chapter 11 when Yeshua called unto Lazarus, said that he slept, but He's going to awaken him out of his sleep. He's going to resurrect him from the dead. We are going to look at John chapter 11 and verse 19, where it says, "And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother." Notice it's the Jews who is bringing comfort to Mary and Martha regarding the situation with Lazarus. Remember, what does Lazarus represent? The exile of the nation of Israel. And how do religious Jews view the exile? Ultimately, while it is long, it is at the same time just temporary. Because there's going to come a day when there's the end of the exile, and the Messiah is going to come, gather the exiles of Israel, and set up His kingdom. And so that is the comfort while you are in exile. And it's the Jews who primarily have this belief and this thought process in their daily religious beliefs. And so that's why they're the ones that's bringing the comfort. Now, comfort is biblically associated with ending the exile of the 12 tribes of Israel. We're going to see how this is so. We're going to begin by looking at Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1, which says, comfort ye, my people, says your God." And who is He going to comfort? Isaiah chapter 51 verse 3, "The Lord will comfort Zion." And so what is the comfort of Zion? It says He will comfort all her waste places. Her waste places is exile. And make her wilderness, that's exile, like Eden. That's the Messianic era. And her desert, that's exile, like the garden of the Lord. That is the Messianic era. Joy and gladness shall be found therein. Thanksgiving and the voice of melody. The thanksgiving and the voice of melody is marriage talk. That the gathering of the exiles of Israel is going to be likened to the joy of a wedding. There's going to be a reunification of northern kingdom with southern kingdom. Now let's look at Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 13. "Then will the virgin rejoice in the dance, both young men and old together. I will turn their mourning," that is exile, "into joy." That's the end of the exile. "And in turning their mourning into joy, I will comfort them." Their joy is associated with their comfort. Their comfort is, "Then will the virgin rejoice in the dance." It is likened to the joy of a marriage. So the unification of the 12 tribes of Israel is likened to a marriage. It's likened unto joy, celebration, and it is comfort because there is no more exile. There's no more of the enemies of the nation of Israel to rule and reign over them with cruelty. Now, in the traditional annual cycle of studying and reading the Torah that is and has been done for many years by the Jewish people, that at a certain point of the year there are readings from the prophets regarding the comfort to the nation of Israel regarding their situation in exile. And there are 7 weeks out of the year where there's readings from the prophets in succession regarding this comfort. And these words of comfort are happening during the period of the year where there is a mourning over the exile and the situation with Jerusalem. And so let's look at these 7 HAFTAROT of comfort. Rabbi Avraham ben David of Lunel, the author of Sefer HaMahig, Sefer means book, he writes the following. From the Parashah Breshit, that is the weekly Torah reading, in Genesis, through the 17th of Tammuz, that is on the Jewish calendar, the HAFTAROT, which is the reading from the prophets that corresponds with the reading of the Torah, that it is chosen to correspond to the Parsha, or the weekly Torah topic. And it's done each week. What is chosen from the prophets is chosen according to match the topic of the Torah portion. But from the 17th of Tammuz on, the next 7 weeks, the choice of the reading from the prophets, which is the HAFTAROT, is determined entirely by the time of the year and the corresponding historical events. The time of the year is the mourning over Jerusalem and the exile, and the historical events is the destruction of the first and second temples. On the 9th of Av, on the Jewish calendar, marks the destruction of the first temple and the second temples. Both were destroyed on the Jewish calendar on the 9th of Av. And 3 HAFTAROT, that is readings from the prophets, in 3 successive weeks, are known as the 3 HAFTAROT of punishment. And they are read on the 3 Sabbaths that precede the 9th of Av. However, on the Sabbath following the 9th of Av, there begins the series of the 7 HAFTAROT of comfort or consolation. Now you remember Simeon in the New Testament. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, the comfort of Israel. And the comfort of Israel that Simeon was waiting for was the coming of the Messiah to redeem and forgive the sins of the nation of Israel and to gather and unite the 12 tribes of Israel to end the exile. That was what Simeon was waiting to see. We understand in the Scriptures that the fulfillment of this is through both the first and the second coming of the Messiah. So now let's look at the 7 HAFTAROT of comfort. These are the 7 readings from the prophets that is going to correspond to the Torah portion that is going to be thematically connected to the season of the year. That is mourning over Jerusalem and the exile. So in the first week of the 7, we have the reading from Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1, which says, be comforted, my people." Then the following week, we have the reading from Isaiah chapter 49, verse 14. Week 2. "Zion said, the Lord has left me. The Lord has forgotten me." So the exiles of Israel, Zion is being told, be comforted. But Zion's reply is, but where is the Lord that delivers me from my exile? I'm not comforted. It seems like I'm forsaken. It seems like I am forgotten. Then we have the third week, where there's a reading from Isaiah chapter 54, verse 11, where we read, impoverished one who has endured storms. So the spiritual status of Zion is she's gone through storms. She's impoverished. And so that's what's told to her in the third week. Now in the fourth week's reading, it comes from Isaiah 51 verse 12, where Zion is told, I, even I, am the one who comforts you. It's myself who brings you comfort. Now, how ultimately does the Almighty bring comfort? When He pours out His Spirit upon Zion. And that's why it says in Isaiah, in chapter 35, Isaiah in chapter 35, verse 7, and the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. And then it goes on to say, and the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion. So, in delivering the exiles of Israel, before the deliverance comes, Zion is going through trials, tribulations, storm. And her land is likened unto a wilderness, likened unto parched ground. So when He pours out His Spirit, then the thirsty land becomes springs of water. So in the wilderness, you have to be thirsty for the God of Israel. You have to be crying out for Him. You got to be seeking His face and praying for the outpouring of His Spirit. That's the thirsty land. Those who are thirsty in the wilderness. That's who He pours out His Spirit, and He brings springs of water. Now in the 5th week, we have this reading. Sing, you who were barren. And so Zion is told to sing because her comforter is going to comfort her. Then the 6th week, she's told to awaken out of her spiritual slumber. Arise, shine. Isaiah chapter 60, verse 1. And then in the 7th week, she's told, I will surely delight in the Lord. She's comforted, and she is going to delight in her deliverer, the one who brings her comfort. Now, these 7 weekly readings are structured to communicate a communication between the God of Israel and the exiles, Zion. And so we look at this. The 7 HAFTAROT of consolation can be viewed as a conversation between the Holy One, blessed be He, the people of Israel, and the prophets. On the first Sabbath, the Holy One says to the prophets, be comforted, my people. But the people refuse to accept the comforting words of the prophets. So that we hear on the 2nd Sabbath, and Zion answered, the Lord has left me, the Lord has forgotten me. But on the 3rd Sabbath, the prophets report to the Lord, the impoverished, the storm-tossed one has not been comforted. She refuses to accept comfort from us. She wants to hear it from you alone. Therefore, on the 4th Sabbath, the Holy One, blessed be He, assures the people, it is I, even I, who comforts you. The 5th Sabbath, she says, sing out, you who were barren, you had not been given birth. The 6th Sabbath, arise, give forth light, for your light has come. And then on the 7th Sabbath, it is only then that the people of Israel believe that her time of suffering is over, and she declares, I rejoice in the Lord, my soul will delight in my God. It's Yeshua who comforts the exiles of Israel when He comes and regathers them. Remember, if you believe in Yeshua as Messiah, you got to walk as He walked, 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. And He followed the TORAH of His Father, and He commanded those who believe on Him to do